Thanks all the panelists for your comments. So let's move on to some of the discussion topics. So I might start with the concept that, we've all discussed various aspects of chronic diseases. There's, challenges with understanding the disease pathophysiology, challenges of understanding preclinical model systems, discovery pathways, challenges of clinical development, and obviously engagement from patients and patients' perspectives throughout all of this. What kind of cross-disease learnings do we have at this point in each of these stages, preclinical to clinical development, and how can we apply that to chronic diseases? So I'd say that's an easy one to start with. We'll get to the difficult ones later. So maybe how you can start with that.
Yeah, that's an easy one, and I'm worried about where you're going. Well, I'll focus on the points I made about artificial intelligence, these algorithms being able to dig into something where the pathogenesis isn't well known. So one of the things that's amazed me as I've gotten to know about this area is that, I'll use Tuzar as an example, since we had a speaker, Andrew, from there, and I'm familiar with the company. They have over 1,500 diseases that they've identified that they can generate, knowledge about, let's say. So as they've started to work through that, we saw a pipeline chart. They have about 20 programs where they have identified novel mechanisms of action and the starting point for molecules. And so I guess maybe that comes back to, the computers are agnostic. You feed them a bunch of data, and if there's all these companies that are using all their computational skills to figure out what to do with that data, is that they can they can come up with new things in all sorts of areas. And so that's a nice cross-cutting thing. Is it it doesn't just have to be cancer, it doesn't just have to be something that has more visibility, more funding.
Yeah, good to Susan. You've talked a lot about patient engagement. Are there common sort of themes and technologies for patient engagement for multiple chronic diseases, and how would we go forward with some strategies?
Well, I'm not sure that I can answer terribly well from a technology perspective what some of the cross-cutting lessons or opportunities or tools or platforms might be for patient engagement. There's certainly been a lot of discussion throughout the workshops about how technologies that can be used to bring clinical research to the patient are certainly enabling participation. But I think I might make a distinction between participation and true engagement, where engagement relates more to having a partnership role in helping to set priorities, solve problems, participate in the design of research studies, and so on. In that camp, I think that there are many lessons from other disease areas that can be brought to bear on prevalent chronic diseases. I'll bring up one that we haven't talked about, but that's fairly recent and is pretty exciting, which is the CoreHeme collaboration in hemophilia. This was a collaboration that was jointly led by Green Park Collaborative, the National Hemophilia Foundation, and McMaster's University to convene a group of stakeholders, including patient organizations, researchers, industry, payers, and regulators to drive to consensus on a minimum set of outcomes to measure in phase 3 trials of gene therapies for hemophilia before those therapies got to the phase 3 stage. And through a consensus project, a very rigorous and formal consensus approach, The group was able to agree on a minimum set of core outcomes of bleed frequency, the factor activity levels, duration of expression of the factor gene, chronic pain, healthcare system utilization, and mental health status. And certainly bleed frequencies and factor activity were endpoints that had been used in clinical trials of treatments for hemophilia with other modalities. But the chronic pain, the mental health status, these were guided in large part by the input from patients. And now this collaborative is moving on to develop standardized metrics and instruments that can be used to measure these outcomes across clinical trials to facilitate comparisons for patients, particularly in this setting where choosing one gene therapy may be the last choice you get to make. So I think there are a number of models like this, and some of them are addressing big questions, Operation Warp Speed type questions, but some of these collaborations are focusing on smaller practical considerations, other questions that need to be answered to move these fields forward. So there are a lot of models related to collaboration and true engagement that we can certainly bring into prevalent chronic diseases.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. Along those lines, I mean, obviously we'll have to also design new types of clinical trials with new models and new of engagement, as well as endpoints that are more meaningful. I wonder if I could call on Bettina to talk a little bit about what lessons have we learned through our discussions across the clinical trial space?
Sure, and if I can, I think it's related to your question. I wanted to tack on a little bit to what Susan just said. I think that's a wonderful example that she just talked about in terms of patient engagement and how, because of the patient input, there were additional measures that were added that were being addressed and therapies developed for, or assessments developed for. But at the end of the study, I think what you want to do is also include the patient engagement throughout the study, and at the end, use the feedback for when you're implementing this new technology, therapy, or drug to better inform the next research study. And I think as you are working with patients and community members in clinical trials, you kind of develop a relationship, it builds trust, and it becomes more commonplace, and they become more integrated into the whole study design and can help you direct your research even from the early stages.
Do you see that as a must-do for clinical trials in chronic diseases going forward?
I think so. There's really, especially in larger centers, I mean, we are not at a loss of patients, and patients who are passionate about their conditions and wanting to help the next generation, help their family members if it's a genetic condition, or just help society in general. And so there's little to no excuse, I think, at this point to include patient voices and engagement all along the process.
Yeah, that's good. So assuming, we have great ways of discovery that we can bring together, and patient voices and novel designs, all of this is going to take a lot of resources. None of this is going to happen without significant resources. And I think that will be my question to Grace to address, is to say, how do we engage greater investment into this, or how do we optimize the current investments in this space to actually make some breakthroughs?
Thank you. And I think there are a few themes that we've talked about today in the last couple of Mondays that need to be integrated. To give a couple of examples there. So, for example, we know chronic diseases are, by their nature, progressive. And early intervention is disproportionately critical. And I think a couple of things have been lacking, which is there's a few. One is better biomarkers, better combinations of biomarkers and endpoints that go beyond kind of current animal models. That can point to very early, testing of new paradigms, new drugs, new approaches, with a quick no early on, because they're not going to truly translate to longer term benefit. And that's going to also take, really good collaboration with regulators. So instead of looking at traditional endpoints like mortality, large outcome trials, which are prohibitively expensive, and that's what makes many investors hesitant to invest in these spaces. If there's a way to make that connection from A to Z, that if you invest here and are able to intervene quickly, maybe it's COPD, maybe it's atrial fibrillation, something that I work on, that clearly you can point to studies that show early intervention, reduction of exacerbations or events is truly tied to not just reduction in direct costs, but secondary and tertiary costs. And then get the regulators to agree that all of these things are connected. You get the regulators, you get the payers, and everybody's, on the same page. In addition, we talked about patient engagement. So patients are more than ever, they're educated, they're going on WebMD, they have devices, they're curious, they want to know, they want to take control. Let's bring that in. When you look at, for example, it wasn't a perfect study, but the Apple Heart enrolled 400,000 patients in 6 months. That just to be able, the technology is not diagnostically cleared, but it's an example of people wanting to know about the state of their heart rhythm. And that provides an opportunity to learn about what endpoints, how do we interact with patients to get early involvement early in a disease or before the disease even manifests itself. So I think there are a number of trends that we've discussed that will point to ways we can integrate all of these concepts to actually encourage investment where it's most needed. But it's not going to be easy, right? You have to convince the regulators, you have to convince the payers. It's going to take companies working closely with patients and collaborators with technology companies and academia to basically be able to do proofs here. And I think the way we start is we do pilots, we do proofs of concept in some of these things, and we point the way. And as we have more success stories, then it can snowball from there. So I do think I've also been a partner at a venture capital firm, so as well as an entrepreneur. So I see it from both ends. And if we had all of those things in a more advanced state, I think it would be easier for everybody, and most of all, better for patients.
Yeah, that's really very, very clearly stated. So now I'll ask the harder question to all of you, and that is, if you were, making the decision either from the government perspective or from industry perspective, what would be the top 2 areas you would invest in the area of chronic disease cross-cutting themes? So I'll start with Grace, since she was the last speaker.
Do I only get 2?
You get one choice for each, whether you're a government investor or an industry investor.
Got it. So in government, I would definitely invest in putting money in a consortium, basically, because that money then gets leveraged. So I'm cheating a little bit because it's not just government spend, but by government coming in and committing to tie in regulators, to tie in all of the important components of government, to really listen to the consortium and really be able to bring to bear the greatest innovations, the companies with massive, potential to invest. I think that would be what I would focus on. And maybe we start with one disease area, or maybe we start with it, as Robert talked about, with metabolic disease, which has so many knock-on effects. With regards to investors, I would invest in companies that are taking these novel approaches, that are basically looking at how can we have a proof point where there's a clear case study for taking an unmet medical need, where you can hypothesize that a combination of interventions, long-term, proof of the, long-term proof of the connection to the outcome, and then a true path forward with regulators and payers. So I would encourage, private investors, venture philanthropy, to look at case studies where this could be the case, because there's not enough investment in one fund to solve the whole problem. So I would look at these innovative models and really drive it that way, because not only will they have a better chance of success, but they will also pave the way for other similar investments in slightly different disease areas.
Yeah, great answer. Howie, what do you think?
Well, I'm gonna go with the assumption you wanted me to pick therapeutic areas. So, and I'll confess I haven't necessarily given a lot of thought to this, but based on the speakers we've heard over the past few weeks. So if I was, and I'll explain why. If I was the government, I'd pick obesity slash, I guess, metabolic diseases. And my reason for that is it's very systemic. So in my entrepreneurship classes I teach the students about ecosystems, that it's not enough just to have one. It's oftentimes you can be very innovative in one specific thing, but there's a lot of other things that have to go with it. So electric cars is a good example of that. You need the chargers, right? So people focus so much on whether the Tesla is better than the Ford, but whatever. Tesla has so many more superchargers around the world than anybody else. It's a huge, it's very important to working. So for obesity, the reason I picked that for government is, as we heard earlier today, there's not only the need for medicines, there's all the social things. The thing that really stuck with me is obesity is the new normal. There's just so much you have to work through that I think that's something that governments and all the resources and different parts of people's lives that government policy can impact is important. For companies, I would pick Alzheimer's. And my reason there is that there's also many facets about that, as we heard before. And Susan mentioned the notion of that drug developers weren't even focused on the things that were important to patients. So there's clearly lots that goes into that as well. But I still feel like if if industry could come up with a reasonable intervention, reasonable interventions for Alzheimer's, there's going to be no question that they're valuable and people will pay for them and want to benefit from those.
Yeah, both great points. So I'm going to go to Bettina next. Say, what would you do?
Very great ideas from both Grace and Howie. I love your idea, Grace, about a consortium, and for the government to fund a consortium of groups focused on a problem. I think for the government, it would be great if they could focus on access to care broadly. And I know that's a sticky one. It's probably pretty difficult to do because, some states have Medicaid expansion, some states don't, but there are a number of interventions and programs out there on how states have worked to increase access to care, both at a systems level as well as an individual level for individuals, because so much of chronic diseases is having that chronic disease diagnosed and earlier in the disease process, so that you could have better quality of life and longer term outcomes. I think that in addition to regulators and corporations, I would add academia in there, as well as some patient advocacy groups that to have a seat at the table of this consortium, so that they could be a part of often academic institutions, and maybe I'm a little biased, we work a little bit slower, but we kind of use that time to build relationships within our research with community partners and patient advocacy groups. So I think working with them would be good. If I had to pick a disease site, I would pick, I know cancer the most, but I think any disease where there are, the survival can be hugely impacted by the types of treatment and the time with which treatment could be implemented. And I know it's not just cancer, but any of those diseases that fall into that category where immediate treatment, immediate access to care is critical, is where I would focus.
Yeah, great. Yeah, access to care is a big one, and disparities. So Susan, you have the last word. From the patient's perspective, what would we want to see from government and industry investments in this space?
So I think I certainly agree with Grace and Bettina that a consortium approach is likely to be most impactful, and of course is going to require investment from government and industry as well. If I only get two choices, one of the choices where I would like to see a large collaborative investment is in looking more closely at approaches that can reduce the costs, the risks, and the timelines for clinical development. So I would love to see a consortium really tearing into in a prevalent chronic disease to start with. Can we stand up things like master protocols using Bayesian approaches and particularly for these diseases where most of the patients have more than just one, can we use these kinds of clinical trial designs and structures to do a better job of figuring out how to approach these multi-morbidities and get to answers faster and more cheaply? Can we have one control arm so that we're exposing fewer patients to the controls and enabling greater access to the experimental candidates that we believe can have a benefit? And can we incentivize participation in those kinds of multi-sponsor trials and make those incentives contingent on activities that also will help to reduce future risks? For example, you can participate, you can put your candidate into this trial, assuming that it's an appropriate candidate and we believe in the hypothesis. If it fails, your costs will be capped, but you have to provide access to all of the data on the candidate that we can use to inform future development in this space. Can we look at those kinds of things? Because I think we tend to think about incentives in terms of exclusivity, and then there's an expectation for price concessions on the other end, but are we looking enough at how can we incentivize collaborative work that reduces costs and risks? So that's the first. The second, and this is my bias here is extreme, but I'd like to see industry investing in helping to educate patients about this process of drug research and development and why their participation is so important, not just as subjects in clinical trials, but as experts in their own right who have knowledge that we need to make more progress faster.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great point. So there is a lot of discussion and questions coming from the audience, and some of it, it also touches on this frequent sort of tension between chronic diseases. There's an indication like diabetes, but there are many comorbidities that affect the outcomes of that primary indication. And these could be stress, these could be sleep, these could be obesity, obviously. How do we sort of not only look at these chronic diseases as disease entities, but many of these comorbidities or contributing sort of indications as part of that? And any thoughts on by the panel members on that?
Well, one comment on the comorbidities, and we heard a little bit about this morning, is in my deep research here, I'll give credit to my daughter who is taking a bioethics class, and she was asked to read an article about obesity and COVID. And so, I helped her. She's a senior in high school, and so I helped her with that. And there's been a lot, there's been a lot of publications and stuff, and this clearly was just one data point. But these authors made a very compelling argument that the key comorbidity was basically the obesity part. and you obviously then have the correlation of diabetes, et cetera. But they had, their analysis supported the fact that extra fat tissue increases inflammation, and it was the inflammation that was impacting the immune system and leading to, the comorbidities. So, again, it's another example of the broader ecosystem, so to speak, of trying to understand these things. So I guess in some ways you could, I know there've been, it's not still completely accepted that sort of inflammation is the cause of all these things, but if that is true, or to the extent that's true, it does provide some clarifying, rather than being like, oh, I've got all these different comorbidities I have to deal with. Well, if there is an underlying disease, a pathology, then that actually does help provide some focus and perhaps, provides a way forward with some of these things.
Anybody else from the panel?
Yeah, I think Howie brings up a great point, which is, is there a root cause for some of these? It's not probably the only cause, but it's a key driver. Because one of the things we haven't talked about too much today, but we alluded to in the prior meetings, is just the different genetic background and environmental background of an individual. So you have that component as well. So in some cases, I'm just thinking of the time I spend a lot of time on cardiology now. So, when you think, does AF have a cause? Well, not one cause. I mean, there are some genetic variants that may increase the risk, but there's also the traditional factors that are cardiovascular risk factors: stress, alcohol, all the things that impact a number of different cardiovascular diseases. But when you think of, and then heart failure and all of those things, right? So if you think about, well, how do you treat all of those diseases? Are there things you can do early on that'll mitigate the risk? And do you need to be especially cognizant of both the genetic and environmental background of the patient? So I do think that a lot of times we'll see more comorbidities in one patient than another because of their environmental situation or their genetic background. So I think that's an added layer, as if we don't have enough complexity already, that's an added layer. But again, likewise, there are some potentially, key genetic or environmental factors that impact across all of these. So I think a more holistic approach is really important, and especially important in clinical trials, because if we're not accounting for the right parameters when we're matching population and looking at inclusion and exclusion criteria, we may miss important effects. And so, again, I'm not really answering, there's not a solution to this. I think it's just more awareness of all of the things that come to bear in these complex diseases.
Yeah, and Grace, to just to support that, in different ethnicities, when you become overweight, you get different kinds of fat collects different places, and those different fat types and where they collect impact the inflammation, et cetera, or the certain cell types result in more inflammation and stuff. So that's an example of where exactly, you can say, well, everyone's overweight, but when you actually look at the subpopulations, and we heard that a little bit this morning, the impact on certain populations of the same, BMI, or the same more high level measure can be different.
Yeah, that's great.
And I think one of a positive benefit of that is you then include participants within your clinical trial that have multiple comorbidities. And oftentimes in traditional clinical research studies, you're excluding people that have too many comorbidities because you really want to see how this operates in people that, don't have other conditions that can kind of muddy the waters. But if you design the study because you're interested in the comorbidities and its impact on whatever disease outcome you're looking at, it could really help to diversify your study in a number of ways.
Yeah, like the recent example being, initially there was concern that the vaccines for COVID weren't going to be studied in the elderly, right? Which would be the classic thing you would do in a clinical study, is exclude older, sicker people,
right? Which
of course was, the exact group that we most desperately wanted to be protecting. So.
Bettina, and I completely agree. And Bettina, your point about, making sure, you're exactly right. I mean, we're always excluding comorbidities in trials. And to Susan's point, we need to be more creative about how to design these trials, new statistical approaches, so that we can include all of these populations with enough statistical power, but also be able to do sub-analyses and understand how a particular treatment or a particular overall, pathway is impacting these various populations. So it just adds more complexity, which is why we need more innovative approaches with regulators, et cetera.
And just to follow on to that, Grace, I totally agree, and it brings to mind a fairly recent example, maybe 2 years ago. Rick Pazder and some of his key staff published a paper encouraging industry to include in their clinical trials in cancer patients who were traditionally excluded, patients with brain metastases, patients with other organ involvement. And the approaches that these regulators were recommending were, sure, measure your primary endpoint in the clean population, but enroll patients that look more like real-world patients and include secondary or exploratory analyses in those populations as well. So I think there's an openness to these approaches that don't necessarily, in every case, have to complicate the sort of core, regulatory aims of the trial for licensure of a new medication, but can still provide really meaningful information about what the broader populations look like and how to use these products in the real world should they succeed.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think this is one area where chronic disease clinical trials will need to move to. Is these are there's no single sort of defining outcome for many of these chronic diseases. Do you just look at blood sugar for diabetes, or do you look at various other aspects of diabetes? And once you choose the primary endpoint, you're kind of stuck with that. And those kind of opportunities should be much broader in these chronic prevalent conditions. And I think that's where part of the regulatory and consortium work would be very helpful. Before I hand off to Carl, there's one other question from the audience. It's what is the role of international organizations such as the WHO and others in serving these chronic diseases across the world and in various populations, and how can they be leveraged? Obviously, COVID was a good example of where that WHO played an important role, but there's no reason why it couldn't be similar for depression or other types of chronic illnesses.
Yeah, and some of you may have more specific examples, but there are international consortium in these areas, and within companies, typically, they're thinking about developing medicines for everywhere, not just the country where they're based. And so so for example, Grace and I worked at Gilead, and we had advisory groups with international members, and we had a whole group that was working on figuring out how to get, again, sort of beyond the actual medicines, figuring out how to actually get the anti-HIV medicines distributed to developing countries. And there were things, and there still is things like the PEPFAR program, which is I think was started by the U.S., but has international involvement as well. So so there's clearly opportunity, and like we've been talking about, probably opportunity to do more on an international basis.
I agree. I think that things like convening folks from various regions to develop guidelines, to share learnings, those can be very powerful. Just having the forum to do that. issuing guidance documents, issuing reports. I mean, it may seem kind of dry, but in many cases that can drive a conversation. You're forcing people to get into a room together, or I guess right now, a virtual room together. I do think there's a lot of power in that. And, task forces can be, can be set up and initiatives can be started. And I do think that's important. As Howie was mentioning, in Robert's presentation today, you see a different impact of obesity in different countries and different populations, but a lot of the same issues. So what can we learn, not just from a therapeutics perspective, but a total cost of care and a policy perspective? What has worked in different countries? I was on everybody's using Clubhouse now. I've been on a lot of international discussions there. And the fact that different countries have different setups for incentives for paying is generating different models around solving some of these problems and different entrepreneurship models. And so you can learn from that. You can point to case studies and say, when you have a patient who's covered by the same insurer for 10 years or 20 years, all of a sudden there's an incentive to intervene earlier. So I think there's a lot to learn from other countries and other models. And I think it's very, very important in something like this, particularly as it's not, populations are no longer homogeneous. They are heterogeneous. So you might have people from one nation, but a large population in the US, for example, with origins from that nation and a different genetic background. So it's really important. We can all benefit from sharing that type of information and leading initiatives together.
Yeah, and obviously in regulatory space as well, there's a lot of collaboration that we could do and learn from each other. Things that are approved in Europe take long to get approved in the US or vice versa. Okay, well, it's a great discussion so far. So Carl, if you can continue the trend here, I will yield the floor to you now.
Okay, great. Well, I've got a couple of topics that I'd love to get the group talking about. There's been this concept of kind of radical collaboration. I've heard a couple of people over the past 3 weeks say we need an Operation Warp Speed type of approach to some of these diseases. And Nantha just asked you what your top 2 were, so we've kind of got a list of what some of those might look like. But before I get into specific questions about what would a warp speed effort look like here and how would we think about that, I want to take one that I think probably is related to that question from the audience. How might overall risk for stakeholders innovating in prevalent chronic disease treatment be lowered with an eye toward integrating policy with the stimulus? So we've talked a lot about what we could do with the stimulus, but I think this question specifically is, what should we do from a policy perspective to decrease overall risk for stakeholders and companies that are innovating in these areas? Let me start first. I think I'll just start with maybe Grace, and then I'll just go down the line to Howie, Susan, and Bettina. Go in that order, please.
Yeah, that's a complicated question because there's so many levers that we can pull. I think earlier, there was a discussion about, opening access, right? So access to preventative care is so important. Access to early detection of potential comorbidities, especially with COVID, right? Where there's going to be some long-term impact in these populations. So it's going to be really, really important that patients have access to care. And that should be the #1 priority. I think that's the best return on the dollar, at least in the near term. I think longer term, investing in some of the things that we've talked about, really focusing on key policy changes that can really unlock the investment that's needed, because the government's not going to be able to put all the money into this, but we need to unlock the incentives so that private money does go into it. So I think those are 2 areas. One is in access to care, more patient engagement. And I know that's a pretty general statement, so we have to get into specifics. And the other would be just really, and maybe it's not through the stimulus, but it's really a focus on regulatory barriers. I mean, what's interesting is we've seen during COVID that a lot of regulatory reimbursement barriers have been temporarily lifted with regards to, for example, telehealth. Why can't we look at some of these changes and some of these lessons learned from COVID to carefully not just, shut that door again, but learn what could work for the longer term? So that's an area that, again, it ties to access to care. It ties to regulatory and also unlocking reimbursement when it comes to the government. So I do think that there's, taking some of those lessons and applying them immediately will be really important.
Yeah, and Howie, before you chime in, Grace, if I could just have a quick follow-up, because there was something that we heard early on. I think it might have been session 1. Ken Ehlert from United Healthcare. He had mentioned kind of this health economic model that people would be willing to pay for value-based type medicines. And you're talking about access to preventive care. What would be the health economic barriers to being able to create access to preventive medicines in a value-based type of arrangement?
Yeah, that is a really difficult one because of something we talked about earlier, which is the fragmentation of risk management of populations, right? So people are usually not with the same, insurance provider for a long term, certainly before they get to Medicare. And so the problem is you have employer groups providing, sometimes taking the risk for large corporations. Then you have different managed care. People move, people switch jobs. So it's really, really hard to tie that, especially when it comes to preventive care. I think as you start to get to early disease intervention, it's a little bit easier to tie that together. I mean, again, in my area, the focus right now, AFib, paroxysmal AFib progresses 8 to 10% to persistent, which is much more expensive to treat, every year. So you could see a near-term impact of better intervening. Likewise with COPD, if you have moderate patient population, if you could manage that tightly to reduce exacerbations, you'd greatly reduce that. But when you go into prevention, that's when I think I see employer groups playing a big piece here with companies like Omada and Virta, where they're working with employer groups who have, large patient population and they want to invest in preventative care so that, people can be healthier and come to work. So I do think there's some interesting models there. But back to your question about barrier, the big barrier is that connectivity of who's paying for that early intervention and are they going to reap the reward? So we have to rethink that whole structure to really be able to ramp that up. Last point is I do think there's great patient motivation. So people are trying to take more control of their health, but there's great disparity in education and access. And we want to be careful. If we rely too much on that, we'll continue to drive, a gap between the have and the have-nots. But I do think that patient engagement will be huge in terms of patients being motivated and understanding the connections to their lifestyle to longer term.
Great points. Thank you. All right, so let me look back then to my primary question. Howie, I don't know if you got a chance to think about that, but what are the policy elements here that could decrease risks?
So a few things. I did get a chance to think about that, so thank you. I'll start with just doubling down on the insurance part that Grace mentioned. So the factoid that's always stuck with me is that Americans typically are on a health plan for about 18 months versus if you're in Kaiser, which, is in California is very big. And I know a few other parts of the country, but it's, managed care. It's 26 years at Kaiser versus 18 months. And so, we've all seen studies where Kaiser have done these long-term kind of studies and have figured out what that value, they can capture the value. And so that's clearly, an issue. And so I'm not necessarily saying we need nationalized healthcare, but somehow have to get over that barrier. And there's presumably policy, various policy solutions that would help with that. The second thing is in Operation Warp Speed. The question is to what extent the speed part is relevant or how it's always somewhat relevant, but how important it is. So clearly, with an infectious disease, it was, that's very transmissible. The speed part was really, really important. So part of the policy thing that helped was the government putting up money to put the manufacturing in place at risk before you knew if the product was going to work. So, and that's especially an issue with biologicals. So to the extent there's antibodies or things or proteins or whatever that are the solution, that may be helpful. And again, the speed part's important. If you may be willing to say, well, look, I'm okay if it takes an extra 18 months to wait and see how the certain clinical study looks before, a company does the investment in the manufacturing. But, that's one possibility. And then Grace touched on this. The third one would be the payments, and I've been involved with some companies that are well, you just look at the pharma industry, and we saw a presentation on this. I think the second week is that from Kronos is that you just see the investment has so shifted to oncology and rare diseases. And again, we saw this at Gilead. Gilead has, well, when Grace and I joined Gilead, they had 67 salespeople that were selling, probably close to $1 billion of HIV medicines. That's compares to the classical, diabetes, cardiovascular, wherever, whereas to sell $1 billion, you might have 3,000 salespeople. And so, knowing that at the end of the day, someone's going to pay for the medicine, I think that is one that could be very important. And then just the last thing is that, I don't remember if this was one of our speakers or something I read somewhere else in the past couple of weeks, is that there's the donut hole for Medicare patients, and there's lots of research now that shows that when people with Medicare approach their donut hole, they quit taking their medicines. Mm-hmm. And so, it's, and then the donut hole was a political compromise, way back when to sort of, get things approved, but you see how it inadvertently impacts, how people respond to medications, and probably has more of an impact based on your socioeconomic, where you fall on that spectrum as well. And so, so there are some little things that even with the medicines we have today that policy could change and improve access to care.
Yeah, those are good points. Maybe the last year with COVID, it's going to change our Salesforce model too for things like that.
Yes,
so
more.
Maybe you don't need the thousands anymore to sell a large product. Maybe there's better ways to do this.
That would help.
Yeah. Susan, what do you think from a patient's perspective, representing kind of the broader patient populations? What do you think are the key policy elements that could help decrease risk here?
Well, I don't know if it's probably a combination of policy and regulation. And I'm sort of coming at this thinking about the type of risk that has reduced investment in this space, and some of the tools that we've spent a lot of time discussing that can help to decrease that kind of risk, particularly around integration of AI and real-world evidence. And in order for that to bear out, we're going to need to do a lot of work on data protection, who owns the data, how it can be used, and who gets to say so. And this is something that's of crucial importance to patients, particularly when it comes to their personal data, whether those data have been generated in the context of a clinical trial or in the context of routine care. So I think that there's quite a bit of work that needs to be done, both in establishing the rules of the road for the ownership and use of those data, and also in educating the public about how those data can be used, will be used, should be used, and the importance and value of those data. So I think that that's a key area that we maybe don't necessarily talk about as much from the standpoint of reducing risk, but we need the data. We need to make sure that we're deriving maximum knowledge from the data that we've invested to generate. And there's an awful lot of work that has to be done to make sure that we're doing that in a way that's responsible and equitable and productive.
Yeah, that reminds me of an experience I've had in the past year with COVID, where data sharing became free-flowing. It was actually quite liberating, having spent my whole career in industry, to be able to just talk about data the day it came off. So that was nice. And of course, the famous quote, right, from Henry Ford, and I'm sure I'm not getting it right, but it's amazing what people can do when no one cares who gets the credit. So, to your point. Yeah. Bettina, do you have anything you'd like to add around this topic as well?
These are great suggestions that were already brought up. I don't have much to add, but the first thing that came to mind was insurance and access to care. But I think in doing that, it's also important to think about the implementation of it and the uptake of whatever those policies are among individuals. When we think about warp speed, the vaccine rollout I think it's meant to be a warp speed distribution of the vaccine. And we notice that across the country, different states are doing, differently in terms of how they're managing that and how they're distributing it. And some are able to distribute it faster than others. And even here within where I am in Missouri, certain areas of the state are doing better than others in distributing the vaccine. And then that's distributing it, but it's not helpful until it's actually in the arms of people, right? And so that's where I'm thinking about the uptake of whatever policies that are put in place. Even if it's insurance, we need people to enroll in the insurance and use the insurance to seek the medical care or to take the prescriptions if they have expanded prescription coverage and things like that in order to really have an impact.
Yeah, it's really good. Yeah, so, the way I've been this thing's manifested in my brain for a year or so now. And I always, many of you have heard me talk about this, hear me think about this whole idea of incentivizing R&D between what can we do to push and what happens to pull. And most of the answers around the policy issues were what could we do to help the pull, the economic part of it, to incentivize people to pull. I've always contended there's a push element here as well, understanding the underlying biology of the disease, having targets that are translatable and qualified for or validated for their use. So in the context of Operation Warp Speed type of consortium and concerted effort and energy around a disease state, what type of things could happen? It can be policy or just actions that could take place to create a warp speed type of approach for push elements of these barriers. And maybe I'll start there. I'm going to come right back to you, Howie, because I think I've had a couple of conversations with you, or at least ones you've been in around this topic. I'll start with you, and then we'll see what others have to say as well.
Yeah. So the place to start would be what the NIH is doing. So there are programs across a lot of these areas, as we all know. I don't know what their budgets are. And so a good starting point would be looking across the various NIH, groups, seeing what they're spending their money on, how much they're spending, and compare that to some of the things we've been able to do with COVID, and just be very, whether it's a blank sheet of paper, or very open-minded about changing, potentially changing the ways we do some of those things. So that's where I'd start. It's not, again, it's not like it's not double negative. It's not as if we're doing nothing, in those areas. And then there's, a lot of those are, maybe then there's an element of the consortium approach that we've talked about. Is I know there are programs where industry can collaborate with NIH, but and I know there are programs set up, but maybe part of that, part of the finding would be there needs to be more sort of pre-competitive or industry, government partnerships on digging into some of those areas, and finding ways to make sure what comes out of that is, in the pre-competitive spirit, there's stuff that comes out of that everybody can use, but then you can still, as a pharmaceutical company or a startup or biotech, be incentivized to patent your own compounds or your own approach of the way you use that, information.
Yeah, no, that's good. I'm kind of thinking too, I'm going to keep going to others in the group as you're thinking about this, but we were all pretty charged up, I think, this morning hearing Bob kind of his platform argument of urgency that we had here. And I know as we look for these prevalent diseases that are actually creating, it's big, in many cases, larger public health issues in the U.S. as COVID. what would be the most dramatic thing we could do to incentivize some of the basic research in translational medicine and clinical trials? We've talked about patients, we talked about technologies, we talked about patient insights and endpoints, simplifying trials. We've covered so much in the past 3 weeks around this, which has been great. But if you had to kind of think about what's the most radical thing we could do to make a difference, and when I'm thinking radical, I was making some notes as I was hearing discussions earlier today. Someone mentioned Alzheimer's disease, an area we work in at Lilly, but we were also involved in some of the early trials of COVID on Act 1 and Act 2 that was happening in NIAID. And to just give you some contrasting differences there between an early effort in COVID with existing anti-inflammatory drugs like, well, Gilead's wasn't existing, but remdesivir and then baricitinib. Those trials were enrolling within a few weeks, 20 patients a day. I mean, it was just incredible, right? Contrast that to Alzheimer's trials that average about half a patient per site per month. So if we had to do something really radical, how would we take an environment that incentivizes R&D and clinical trials to half a patient per site per month to 20 a day? Because there's we just heard 2 weeks ago, 5.8 million patients in the US, and one new patient, I think, was it a day? I forget the exact metric, but it was profound. What's the most radical thing we could do to incentivize this early work, this clinical discovery and early clinical work? And maybe I'll start with Grace, and then Bettina. I'm going to give you guys time to think about it. I'll start with Grace, Bettina, and then Susan. We'll go in that order.
I get to improvise, huh?
You get to improvise,
yeah.
Yes.
Well, a couple of thoughts, right? I spent, Howie and I actually spent a bit of time at Gilead also working on Tamiflu and thinking a lot about, respiratory viruses and sort of the cadence of that, right? It's a whole different area of innovation and unmet need because it's traditionally been underinvested. Antivirals and antimicrobials in general, right? Any sort of anti-infectives. And it's always a crisis when it happens. It's like earthquake preparation. You never stock up until the first earthquake. At least, maybe I'm giving something away here. I'm not as prepared as I should be. But the truth is that, you talked about clinical trial enrollment. Obviously, in the midst of the crisis, everybody's desperate for a treatment. I think it's a lot easier, but it's also challenging. Think about clinical development in the context of a treatment paradigm that's evolving daily. Where a lot is not understood about the disease, about the immune response, about all of the other areas you talked about. So there's, a need for an antiviral, there's need for anti-inflammatory, there's need for anticoagulation, there's need for all of these things, and you're learning it on the fly. You're building the airplane as it's flying. That's a really challenge. On the one hand, there's a lot of motivation because people are scared. So there's going to be a lot of motivation to enroll. On the other hand, so many companies have pivoted and are really struggling right now because they didn't have, a good protocol because we don't understand what's going on. The paradigm's evolving. And then long term, what's the commercial prospect? So I think that's one extreme where you can get a lot of enrollment, but keep in mind those challenges. But what can we learn from that? When you have another challenge in enrollment, and I ran ClinOps at Gilead at one point too, so acutely aware of enrollment challenges. I think one of the challenges is patient motivation and caregiver motivation. There's been so much frustration and so much failure, unfortunately, despite best efforts in a disease like Alzheimer's. And it's obviously very challenging for the patient and for the caregivers. And so I think what you have to have is the promise of true innovation so that patients feel like, they're much more educated now. They're going to want to sign up for trials where they feel like there's a there potentially. Two is you need to get them more engaged in general. A lot can be achieved and a lot has been achieved over the last 5-10 years by partnering with the patient advocacy groups to communicate through them. They're the channel to the patients. And it can be done, I think, ethically. If you truly have the intention of, we want to get the word out. We want you to help us educate. Here's transparency around the risk benefit of what we know today. So I think patient engagement, more direct outreach to patients and education, and then really focusing on truly true innovations. It might be a breakthrough therapy or it might be a new approach. I do think those are things that can really accelerate using engagement tools. So I just wanted to caution, the COVID context, of course, it's very exciting to see that rapid enrollment, but let's keep in mind all the complexities. And then on, how to get the lower, site enrollment rates up in other areas, I think, and my co-panelists, please chime in, those are some of the elements that I think that can really help.
Okay, good. Well, I've just been reminded that we are getting close to time. So actually, Bettina, I said I'd come to you next. So let's go with Bettina. And then after that, I'm going to ask Anantha to kind of wrap things up with some closing comments. So Bettina?
Well, I didn't have much to add to this topic. So if we're short on time and one of the other panelists has something that they'd like to share, I'll yield. Yeah.
Okay.
Actually, I'd like to comment on that. Naturally, of course, I agree 100% with Grace that patient engagement is incredibly key to this, but let's not forget about physician engagement, and particularly community physicians. And this ties into something that we heard about quite a bit throughout the presentations, particularly when it comes to prevalent chronic diseases such as obesity and diabetes, and even to a certain extent Alzheimer's disease, that there is this acceptance that this is just something that happens. There is a stigma and a shame and a blame that is placed on patients. And, I can't tell you how many people in my close personal circle who are extremely obese, who go to physicians with other problems, crippling osteoarthritis, and the only solution for them is lose weight. Well, I've already radically changed the way I eat. The only thing left for me is exercise, and I can't because I can barely make it from the couch to the bathroom for the pain. We need to engage physicians, and we need to break through this cultural idea that these conditions are either inevitable, unfixable, or due to poor lifestyle choices or poor patient decisions, and characterize this as a research question that needs to be invested in and a series of conditions that actually we can improve.
Thanks. Thanks, Susan. I did promise you all the hardest question yet. So actually, I'm going to ask Dr. Caleb if he can join, because he is going to be the hardest question you guys can ever answer. Rob, are you able to join?
Yeah. Hey, Anantha.
That's unfair, You
want me to ask a question?
Yes. Ask this panel a hard question. You've heard all this stuff that we've discussed.
Oh my gosh, this is really it's hard to come up with a succinct question, but I'll give it a shot. I guess since this we are an offshoot of the forum on drug development and discovery, maybe a good question would be, if there's one thing the FDA should do in the next year that would help align the ecosystem, which I think you all have very well described, what would be your advice for the next FDA commissioner about what should be done in the next year?
Okay, I'll put in my 2 cents. Better communication, the rapid, quick communication would be great.
I'll go next. I would have an area, couple of areas of requests. One is to really collaborate on novel endpoints, especially composite endpoints. Really have a much bigger focus on adaptive trials and the ability to use retrospective data collection, if appropriately analyzed and supported, to support earlier approvals, especially for areas of high unmet need.
And I think I would harken back to some of the things that we've talked about earlier today, if we could focus on the inclusion of patient and community voices across the continuum of the study designs would be important.
I'll go and I'll offer something that is probably provocative and grossly unpopular, particularly among industry. But within the next year, if the new FDA commissioner could find ways to disclose more information from its review activities prior to products being approved so that others can learn lessons and not step in the same holes that developers have already stepped in, I think that would be game changing. I don't know whether that's disclosure of redacted complete response letters or some intermediate step, but finding ways to share those learnings before we have to wait till the end of the development program.
So, Rob, you didn't ask me, I'm not on the panel, but I'm going to give you an answer anyway. You know, one thing that I've been able to enjoy through this very difficult time in the past year is the very transparent and open dialogue between leaders in the FDA and industry that's working on COVID therapeutics. We didn't just have a shared transparency, we had a shared sense of urgency. So I would ask them to identify these areas that are most important to the US government and the public health, identify those, transparently communicate what those are, and then treat them the same way. Let's have a shared sense of urgency around those topics, those diseases.
Well, Rob, I know you can plead the fifth, but do you have your own suggestion?
Well, I actually think that was a great set of answers. I hope someone wrote them down because they're good suggestions. There's, of course, a modifier to every suggestion. And, I'd say the thing I'm grappling with the most is let's assume that we could identify the most, the biggest priorities. And, having to do that with the sensitivity that people with rare disease, I think are really getting benefits, as was well described, from policies that are in existence. So we don't want to go back on those policies. Then I think the issue becomes bigger than FDA. I think the big issue is how to balance the economic issues that are really in play here. And I didn't want to ask that as a question because it's hard to give a succinct answer. But, for example, to what Carl said, one thing about COVID is we opened the national treasure chest and just poured out the money. We just can't do that for everything.
Right.
And so there was very little for industry, for example, to lose by playing ball because the risk was essentially taken out of it by upfront payments from Warp Speed for most of what was done. And so I really think the economic incentives are going to be enormous here. But that's well beyond just the remit of the FDA. It's going to take some serious policy discussion to deal with it. And I really liked what several people said about this sort of recedes into the background. Heart disease, kidney disease is just part of what happens. So depression, so we don't treat it as an urgency. But if we do, we're going to have to work out the economics for it to work.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And I think, as you said, Merck would not be manufacturing J&J product if the feds weren't buying 1 billion doses of it at premier price. So I think the economic driver is quite important, as well as, obviously the humanitarian drive.
And if I can just jump in, one thing that I think sort of is relevant to that comment is that some of you may have seen this, is that I've read a couple articles recently that it's okay if 100 people die every day from COVID because that's on average how many people die every day from flu. And as Grace and I know, 100 people don't need to die every day of flu. It's just, it's the same old thing. It's like, well, we're used to 100 people dying every day of flu, so that's okay.
Yeah.
So there's, clearly we need more focus on this.
Yeah, so thank you all. This is really a terrific discussion and great sort of three sessions that we've had, 3 days of great workshops. I think our time is running out here, so rather than do a detailed wrap-up, I would say many great lessons were learned in these 3 sessions that could all be put together in a summary statement, and more work to be done, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of follow-up work. So thank you all again, and I'll just hand it over to Carl to also thank and close the session.
Yeah, it's been a great 3 sessions here. Thank you all that's participated. Thank you everyone who's joined online and been a part of this. I look forward to this just being the first step of a long journey that we'll all take together. As we're wrapping up, I also want to thank the planning committee again. They all put